Good evening, and thank you everyone for joining us. I am the Mayor Pro Tem Devin T. Murphy, and I will be chairing our meeting tonight. I now call our special meeting to order of March 22nd, 2022. Next item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Moving down to item number 2 of the agenda, we have the land acknowledgement. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the Ohlone people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place Ohlone land, the land that Pinole sits upon, their home. We are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Ohlone community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. Thank you. We're now on to item 3 of the agenda, roll call and City Clerk's report. Madam City Clerk, if you will.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Salimi, Mayor Salimi, I will note, is absent. Mayor Pro Tem Murphy.
Here.
Councilmember Tave is joining us virtually. Looks like we're working on his audio, but I'll note that he's here. Councilmember Toms.
Here.
Councilmember Martinez Rubin.
Good evening. Here.
City Manager Murray.
Here.
City Attorney Kasher.
Here.
Mayor and Council, the agenda was posted on Thursday, March 17th at 4 p.m. with all legally required notices. A written comment was received, distributed to Council, and posted online in advance of the meeting. Does the Council have any conflicts to report this evening? That concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam City Clerk. Next on the agenda is citizens to be heard. Madam City Clerk, citizens may speak under any item not listed on the agenda. The time limit is 3 minutes for City Council items and is subject to modification by the Mayor. Individuals may not share or offer time to another speaker. Pursuant to provisions of the Brown Act, no action may be taken on a matter unless it's listed on the agenda or unless certain emergency or circumstances exist. The City Council may direct staff to investigate and or schedule certain matters for consideration at a future meeting. Madam City Clerk, do we have any speakers this evening?
Yes, thank you. We have one speaker, Jack Meehan.
Good evening, Mayor and members of the Council, those present and those virtually present. For those of you who are not familiar with my annual visit to the City Council to speak on behalf of the fire service, not just Pinole's, but all the fire service, because it was 23 years ago that I died on the freeway, driving about 65 miles an hour. My guardian angel wife next to me was able to bring the car to a stop. And from this point on, all I know about it is what I read in the paper. So I'll tell you what I read in the paper. A number of Good Samaritans stopped and lent their talents. An MD, or respiratory therapist on the way to work at Brookside Hospital, an off-duty EMT, and 1 or 2 other people, one of whom might have been a journalist, because the newspaper article was quite detailed. At any rate, 3 days later, I woke up and was told how it happened, what had happened during that time. Well, not my recollection, but from the article, the Good Samaritans got me out of the car, rendered artificial respiration, cardiac, pulmonary resuscitation, and nothing worked. I was dead. And a fire crew from Loyola showed up, and the three firefighters, they were firefighters, not EMTs, not paramedics, with a new device called a defibrillator. And Jackson, Pinole, and Bowden, I'll remember those names, I guess, for a long time. Anyway, they gave me a shot, and it didn't work. And so they pondered for a moment, gave me another shot, and according to one report, it worked. According to a personal interview afterwards with the fireman, it was the third shot that got my heart started. And so I express my gratitude to the fire service with this admonition. They probably know it already. If at first you don't succeed, try again, and again, and again. Thanks, fire service.
Thank you, Madam City Clerk. Are there any other public comments?
Do we have any virtual hands?
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem. Just double checking. There are actually no virtual hands, so no comments.
All right, thank you so much. Great, so I will close the public comment period for citizens to be heard, and we will move on to our next agenda item. It's now time for our study session item. City Manager Murray, would you like to start us off with an introduction to item 5, study session, the introduction and discussion of the land use planning for Pinole project?
Mayor Pro Tem, this is your Community Development Director, Lily Whalen. I would like to introduce the consultant.
Thank you, Director Whalen. Welcome and good evening.
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, council members. Tonight I'm pleased to introduce the consultant team from Michael Baker International, who will be working closely with the city over the next 14 months to prepare updates to the city's housing and health and safety elements, in addition to a new environmental justice element of our general plan. Issues of housing, environmental justice, safety, and hazard planning and climate change are all linked together, and planning for all of these efforts simultaneously will result in a more comprehensive and holistic approach to these issues. And there's also efficiencies related to outreach, environmental analysis, and adoption and implementation efforts. So tonight we'll be receiving an introduction to the project as a whole from the consultant. And Michael Baker International, as a professional firm, has extensive experience with this type of work. They've completed over 100 housing element updates in previous housing element cycles, and also for the current 6th cycle have completed 9 updates and are currently working in the Bay Area region with the cities of Delroy and Los Altos Hills. The consultant team is organized as a strong technical team of 11 housing, safety, and environmental experts, including representatives here tonight on the screen. So we have project manager and health and safety lead, Surabi Barbhaya, fair housing and engagement lead, Emily Elliott, housing lead, Dan Weary, and environmental justice lead, Noelle Steele. Furthermore, the team includes strategic advisor, Veronica Tam, who you'll see later over the next couple of months here, who prepared Pinole's last housing element update, in addition to an evacuation routes study lead, a CEQA lead, and a team of supplemental support staff. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Emily, who will be kicking off the presentation this evening to the council.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Lily. All right, just give the team a second there. Great, and we can go ahead and advance to slide 3, since we've gone ahead with the team introductions. Perfect. So the goals for today's meeting are to review the requirements for the updated housing element. And we'll be talking about the different required components, the process for the plan update and public engagement, and review crucial recent legislation. We're also going to introduce and describe the health and safety element update and the new environmental justice element. We will discuss an overview of the project schedule, and we'll conclude with a question and answer and public comment section. The This presentation is about 35 slides long, and it'll be about 30 to 35 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end. Okay, next slide. Go ahead into the next one. For the person who's running the slideshow, just know that there's some transitions on these slides, so you can kind of follow along with me to click through. Thank you so much. All right, so what is the housing element? The housing element is one of 8 required elements of the city's general plan. The state law requires that housing elements be updated every 8 years, and the next update must be completed by January 31st of 2023. The housing element is a plan for the city to meet the demand of housing for all income needs, and importantly, it helps meet the needs of the broader Bay Area region, as well as the needs of Pinole residents. The key components are assessing the city's housing needs, the constraints to housing, and housing resources. And based on these assessments, the city will set goals, objectives, and policies and commit to specific programs. And this includes a zoning plan that identifies specific sites to meet housing needs for all incomes. Now, this is called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and that's kind of a mouthful, so you'll typically hear it referred to as the RHNA. The city has a 500 unit RHNA, and this is the number, or this number is the share of Pinole to help address the regional housing shortage. And we'll discuss a little bit further in this presentation how that RHNA number is developed. Additionally, the city must include specific programs to promote fair housing. And then in our case, this really means facilitating the development and construction of affordable housing. Next slide. So like we just covered, the housing elements are required by law to be updated on 8-year cycles. We're currently in the 2015 to 2023 cycle, and this is known as the 5th cycle. And the upcoming element is called the 6th cycle. The Bay Area's housing elements are due on January 31st of 2023. The state law does provide for a 120-day grace period. So what this means is that the latest that the city could adopt the housing element to be compliant with state law is actually May 31st of 2023. This grace period would allow for a second HCD review and comment if necessary. And I should say HCD stands for Housing and Community Development Department of the State of California. Before the city adopts the housing element and HCD reviews the document, the city will, let me back up for a second, I read that wrong. Before and after the city adopts the housing element, HCD reviews the document for compliance, and the state will make findings and possibly, most likely, request revisions. Again, one of the main purposes of the housing element is to create a plan to accommodate the RHNA. All right, next slide. So I'm going to cover the major components of the housing element itself. The housing element is a big document, and it's got some hefty chapters, and these are the primary components. The first is the review of accomplishments, and this evaluates the previous housing element, including housing production, implementation of programs, and any assistance that may have benefited individuals with unique housing needs, such as people who may be elderly or disabled. Next is the needs assessment. And this is an analysis of existing and projected housing needs. This typically involves a very comprehensive demographic analysis using census and ABAG data. This section also needs to consider the broader regional and sub-regional needs. And then next is the housing resources. It's an inventory of available land, funds, grants, and incentives for housing. This section details how the city will provide the zoning and production necessary to comply with the RHNA. And the heavy emphasis in this section is how the city will provide adequate zoning for multifamily units, particularly those that may be affordable to lower or moderate incomes. The next section is constraints, and this is an analysis of anything that may deter or increase the cost of housing production. We look at 2 types of constraints. First is governmental, and this could be things like permit processing procedures or development standards that may be difficult to comply with, or development fees. And then non-governmental constraints are things like flood and fire zones, economic constraints, things like interest rates or the price of construction or land. And finally, fair housing. This is a new section for the 6th cycle, and it's an assessment of fair housing conditions, commitment to meaningful actions that improve fair housing. This section will involve an assessment of the city's conditions against those in the immediate and larger regions. And then finally, there's an implementation plan. So goals, policies, and implementation programs to meet unmet housing needs, remove constraints, provide zoned capacity, and improve fair housing conditions. Essentially, these are actions that the city will implement during the next 8 years to meet state law. And we can go to the next slide. So there has been a lot of legislation passed in the last 5 years about housing. 30 bills last September, more than expected. I'm going to highlight 4 recent bills that have changed requirements to housing elements in their implementation. And I do understand that the City Council got a really nice primer in the last couple of weeks on some of these housing bills. The first one is AB 1398, and it was passed, just went into effect in January. It changes the timeline for required rezoning for the housing element. So it requires cities to obtain HCD approval of the housing element before the 120-day grace period expires. So in Pinole's case, that would be May 31st of next year. If HCD has not approved the housing element by then, the city is required to rezone within 1 year to remain in compliance with state law. And I want to just say, at this point in time, we don't know if Pinole needs to rezone or not. So this would only apply if we determine that there is that the current zoning cannot meet the required RHNA. And so therefore, if rezoning is required and the housing element is not compliant by May 31st, then that rezoning effort needs to be completed within a year. If the housing element is found to be in compliance, then the city gets 3 years to implement that rezoning program. And this was the previous time period. Some of you might be familiar with a 4-year HCD cycle. And in the past, this was kind of the stick that HCD used as a means to get cities to comply with, or obtain compliant housing elements. But with AB 1398, the 4-year cycle goes away, and instead it's replaced with this requirement to rezone within 1 year. The next is Assembly Bill 215, and this changed the timeline for HCD to review. So it increased the time for the initial release and receiving HCD comments to 4.5 months. And in this 4.5 months, it's a minimum 30-day public review of the housing element, plus a minimum of 10 days for the city to consider any public comments and work those into the housing element, and then a 90-day HCD review. Taken together, the city has less time to conduct the update, as well as more significant penalties for not completing it on time. Now the city will have to release the draft housing element for at least 40 days prior to sending it out for HCD review. So in the past, HCD initially had a 60-day review period, and there was no mandated public review comment period. And then Assembly Bill 1397 is fairly significant, a bill addressing the RHNA. It sets more stringent requirements for RHNA sites, and the city must prove or demonstrate the likelihood and feasibility of development of the RHNA sites within the 8-year cycle. In the past, some jurisdictions have been able to get their RHNA certified using sites that were clearly not going to develop within 8 years. In this cycle and under this bill, cities have to justify their site selection and demonstrate that sites are likely to develop within that planning period. And then Senate Bill 166, this was commonly known as the no net loss law, and it adds responsibilities to the city during the review cycle. So the city needs to maintain adequate capacity for all income levels throughout the 8-year period, requires rezoning if a site is developed at lower density than predicted or different income level than predicted. So for example, If you have a site that is counted for 10 units in the housing element, but the final project only includes 5, the city would need to identify opportunities for another 5 units. So those units must be replaced or rezoned within 180 days of that deficit being recognized. And really what that translates into then is with these new housing elements, we are applying a buffer. That way the city, should it experience a deficit on a site, it has some extra RENA sites already identified to make up for that loss. Right, next slide, please. I'm going to pass it over to Dan.
Great, thanks, Emily. I'm going to get into, some of this will be a little bit of a repeat of what Emily just said, but we're going to take a little bit deeper dive. So first, we just wanted to kind of discuss how we got our RENA. That's the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and that's 500 units for Pinole. Again, first, this originates at the state. HCD and the Department of Finance determine statewide housing needs, and for this 6th cycle, they determined that they need approximately 2.2 million new homes throughout the state. And that 2.2 million are then allocated by household income. So it's not just a gross number, but they break it down between very low, low, moderate, and above moderate units. And then they divide those amongst the various regions in the state. And there's some complicated algorithms of how they figure that out. HCD, so those are then allocated to each of the regions. So HCD determined that the Bay Area had a need of over 441,000 new units. That's the second largest in the state, second only to the Southern California region, which received 1.4 million units. They had a huge increase. So you can see between SCAG and the Bay Area, they've got 1.8 million units. That's a big percentage of the state's total. ABAG then allocated the units, those 441,000, within each jurisdiction in the area, in the region, and Pinole's allocation was 500 units. Next slide. So this slide shows a comparison between the current or prior housing element cycle, that's in green in these bar charts, and then the new 6th cycle that we're planning for right now. So you see the different allocations here, and you see the Bay Area to the left, Contra County in the center, and Pinole to the right, and you see the relative increases there. So you see the Bay Area went from 188,000 to over 440. The county went from 20,000 to over almost 44,000, and Pinole increased from about 300 to exactly 500 this time. So those are increases about 135%, 113%, and for Pinole, about 68%. So even though it's a significant increase for Pinole, it's not as great as it was for the Bay Area or Contra Costa County. So next slide. So as Emily mentioned, when we look at the RENA, we also talk about the buffer and the no net loss requirements. So I just wanted to get into a little bit more. The city must maintain at all times the capacity to meet their RENA. And that's over the full 8-year period from 2023 to 2031. And as she mentioned, if a site's developed, if one of the RENA sites that we identify is developed at lower density than was allocated or assumed for that property, then those need to be made up. We need to make that lost capacity within 6 months. And for this reason, our HCD recommends that we have a buffer, and it's a good idea. Generally, I've seen buffers up to 50%, but generally we recommend about 20% buffer. And then we kind of combine that with conservative allocations and yields and assumptions for the sites that we do designate. So we don't assume, overly optimistic numbers that we're going to get us in trouble. So it's kind of a combination of buffer and reasonable assumptions. And again, the idea is that we don't want to have to amend the housing element, add new sites, or worst case, have to rezone or upzone land, which is more time consuming, costly, and difficult to do, particularly if you have to do it within 6 months. So next slide, please. Thank you. So here we just want to kind of get into that RENA allocation. I mentioned earlier how that distribution is not just a lump sum number, but it's broken down by targets for levels of affordability, and that's related to household incomes. And so you see here in the rows, we've got the 5th cycle RENA, that totaled 297 on the right column. Then we have the 6th cycle RENA, and then we talk about a buffer and percent change. And then the columns left to right are very low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. So we have very specific allocations for each of those. And the way we meet those is generally related to density. So we'll get into that in just a little bit. But bottom line here, you can see the relative changes even by income levels. So overall, we're about 70% increase. That's not including the buffer. And the largest increases were really at the moderate and above moderate levels. But again, around 45 and 50% for the low and very low income as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So again, the city's obligations provide the sufficient land. It's got to be appropriately zoned to accommodate the RENA. And this just kind of looks at it a little bit different way. So we look at those incomes, and this just kind of relates the RENA allocations for those 500 units to the various income levels. And so in that center column under 2021 annual income, this is for 4-person households. And these are all derived or based off the area median income, which for Contra Costa County is $125,000. And so very low incomes are generally less than 50% of that area median income, and low income range between 50 and 80%. And then the median income or moderate income range is between 80 and 100% of that median income. And then above moderate is anything over that 120%, or in this case, $150,000. So that just kind of shows you what we're planning for. So we look at our needs. We're trying to find housing, ideally, where households of this size could afford, a home of that cost, or based on that income. Sorry. Next slide, please. So one of the things I talked about, the various assumptions and requirements. HCD, the way we kind of count and determine that we have sites that are adequate to meet the various RENA obligations, and particularly for those lower income sites, is based on density. And it's ACD kind of uses density as a proxy for affordability. So if you're in a suburban area, and there's 2 different categories. If you're in a suburban area, the minimum density that will count, and this is zoning density, the minimum density that will count toward those lower income RENA obligations is 20 dwelling units per acre. And that's where Pinole is currently, Pinole and Contra Costa County. We note here, though, that could increase to 30 dwelling units per acre with increased population, because it's based on both the city population as well as the county population. And the threshold is at the county level, 2 million population, and we're only about 30,000 below that. So we're certainly, or we're very likely to exceed that threshold within the next 8 years. And then and that's okay, if Pinole remains under a population of 25,000, they can still be eligible for that 20 dwelling unit per acre density, minimum density. However, Pinole is currently around 20,000, so it's possible over the next 8 years that you could grow and exceed that 25,000, and then you'd be required to provide 30 dwelling units per acre. So generally, we're going to probably plan for 30 dwelling units per acre just to be safe and conservative. Let's see. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. If you go back real quick. So I'm just saying those lower income levels, very low and low, will require a minimum density of 20 dwelling units. Will probably require 30. Moderate income doesn't have a statutory requirement, but generally what HCD is accepting is kind of that middle density between single family homes and kind of the higher density multifamily, townhomes. So it's kind of the duplexes, quadplexes, triplex type developments, kind of in between the single family and townhouse or apartment buildings. So we can go to the next slide then. Thank you. So when we talk about the site inventory requirements, there's a number of different factors that we look at. And these are what I mentioned earlier about having reasonable assumptions. We also need to demonstrate all of these factors to the satisfaction of HCD. So first of all, we need to have a realistic capacity. And there's a variety of factors there. So that depends on your zoning, your available sites, the nature, how the site is actually developed, what its condition is. ACD has specific requirements, size requirements for certain sites, particularly for the low income sites. They need to be between 1/2 and 10 acres. There are exceptions to that, but it requires additional demonstration and analysis, again, to the satisfaction of HCD. We're looking for infrastructure, and most of the properties are going to have adequate infrastructure because most of the areas are developed and served with roads and water and sewer and dry utilities. If there are some areas on septic and don't have that capacity, they're still eligible, but they would only, those are going to be lower density sites, and those would only be eligible to meet your above moderate income RENA. Then we're looking for developable land. Again, are there environmental constraints? Are there streams, flood hazards, steep slopes? Are there other improvements already there? And sometimes a lot of their sites we're using or reusing and redeveloping sites, or we're doing infill on existing developed sites. So we look at all of those factors that are available there. And then we look at, and this is a new requirement for the sixth cycle. Emily mentioned how we used to just kind of need to show that we had adequate capacity. It was kind of a paper calculation, show that we had adequate zoning, and we had a number of sites. If you did the math, had enough total units in the various income levels. That was kind of the requirement. Now we've got an additional requirement, and it's significant. We need to demonstrate the likelihood and the viability of these properties, and it tends to be very property specific. So particularly if they're non-vacant sites, we need to show, if they already have some development on there, that those sites can be redeveloped within the next 8 years. Not only that they can be redeveloped, that they're likely to be redeveloped. And in fact, there's a required finding from the city council that we have to make that, these sites in our arena are likely to be developed in the next 8 years, and that any existing uses on the site are going to vacate or not otherwise constrain the development as planned. And then this last section, furthering fair housing. It's kind of a mouthful, but there's a new requirement for affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH. And generally what that means is we need to avoid concentrating new housing, particularly low and moderate income in areas. They want to make sure that these sites have access to resources and opportunity, such as employment and educational facilities and healthy areas. And some of that you'll see comes up later in our environmental justice element and even our safety element. But that's a factor that we will be looking at. And this now requires a big, long chapter on that section alone. Okay, if we go to the next slide, I'll move along. I've only got a couple left here, and then we'll move on to the other sections. So as I mentioned before, we look at the constraints. I kind of already covered this, but we look at the permitted densities of the zoning. We look at how much vacant land there is. And if we don't have enough of that, then we look at suitable sites that are maybe underdeveloped and adequate or ripe for redevelopment or infill development. And we look at even some of the particulars of the zoning. Sometimes it's the permitted densities or parking requirements or height or setback limitations. We look at those to see if there are any particular constraints, and then we'll develop programs and recommendations to adjust those so that they don't become an undue constraint on future development. As I mentioned, we also look at environmental constraints. Go to the next slide. And then, of course, this is this approval is a discretionary act by the city council, and all discretionary acts are subject to CEQA analysis. And this is just a very simple graphic to illustrate that we don't know exactly what the CEQA process is going to be yet. It will be largely determined whether and to what extent we need to rezone. And so if our zoning and sites are not adequate today and we need to create additional sites through rezoning, depending on how much and the extent of those rezonings, that could trigger a more involved CEQA analysis. So we'll be figuring that out as we get into the sites inventory preparation and analysis over the next month or two, and we'll have a pretty good idea on that. So we'll be working on the CEQA strategy with city staff over the next couple of months. So this next slide just kind of talks about what Emily mentioned. So we talked a lot about sites. We talked about arena, and we need to have this sites inventory that demonstrates not only we've got adequate capacity, but those sites are specifically likely to be developed over the next 8 years. We'll develop programs now to help facilitate that. So sometimes not just having the zoning as alone is not enough. So we'll have a variety of programs to meet any particular needs, as well as even adequate sites. So these are just kind of main kind of categories of the types of programs that we typically have. As I mentioned, the first one is adequate sites. And so that would be rezoning, or maybe removing constraints within the existing zoning to allow sites to achieve their full potential. One thing I think the city indicated earlier, that they haven't seen a lot of accessory dwelling units, but maybe there's a slight uptick. Most cities are seeing increased number of accessory dwelling units. And that's a good way to get affordable housing units, because the state allows for roughly 30% of those accessory dwelling units to count toward each of the very low, low, and moderate income categories. So if you have a good number of those accessory dwelling units, a good chunk of those, roughly 90%, will count toward those low and moderate income RHNA requirements. So that's a good strategy. And then there's often, and will be, a number of programs that take the form of educational initiatives to make sure residents, developers, other stakeholders, even staff are fully aware of all the various programs and opportunities and obligations. So it's really important. A lot of people don't follow this, obviously. It can be very kind of wonky, and there's a lot of laws and regulations, but it's important to have an educational component so that people are aware and can take advantage of the various programs and comply with the various requirements. And as I mentioned before, we have a constraint removal set of programs, and that could be zoning. And then also it kind of includes compliance with a variety of the state laws, which as we had over 30 new state laws that were signed into law in September and took effect this January, and there's going to be more. So there's kind of a constant update to those. And then, as I mentioned before, we also have requirements for affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so I'll just go, if we go to the next slide, I think I've kind of talked about the fair housing already, but again, what it really comes down to is taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. And there's a number of kind of key kind of targets or categories that we look at. So fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity, looking at patterns of segregation and integration. We will look at racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty and affluence. And we're trying to kind of find a balance so that we don't have concentrations of one or the other, and try to have a more unified community. And then we're looking at disparities in access to opportunity. So as I mentioned before, we don't want to have those concentrations. So in many cases, a lot of the multifamily tends to be in areas that don't have maybe as good air quality. They're located near the highways. They might not have as good access to parks and recreation or education. So one of the considerations is to look at locationally where we can put that housing in future sites and have access to opportunity. There's a whole range of opportunity categories. And then making sure there's no disproportionate needs or risk of displacement. So again, we don't want to displace good housing or otherwise threaten what may be existing naturally affordable housing with any of the changes that are coming up. And bottom line, HCD is requiring a high level of demonstration of specific metrics, timelines, goals, and they use this to evaluate your performance. So there's an annual performance review that's done every year, and HCD will be looking at those annual reports, but they're going to look very closely to what you promised to do in these housing elements. So with that, I think this is my last slide. We can go to the next slide. Great. There's just great consequences to non-compliance. So I know the city wants to comply. Most do. There's been a few bad actors over time, and it's forced the state to kind of create a lot of these laws and extra enforcement actions. But the main thing is that if we're not compliant, the thing that happens most likely is that you're not eligible for certain state grants, and that's really important. So most cities want that state funding to provide all sorts of assistance, and that's the thing that happens most likely. And so until you get your certified housing element or a letter of substantial compliance, you won't be found in compliance. If for some reason you're really thumbing your nose at the state and you're fighting this and you don't want to adapt a housing element, or you're not keeping up even with your obligations, the state can actually start to fine the city, and that could be at $100,000 a month, and that can go up to $600,000 a month. So it can get very, very steep very quickly. If you're really obnoxious, and I don't think anybody's worried about this here for Pinole, but you can actually lose your local land use authority and can go into court receivership. So the state will take over your housing element and take over your permitting processes until you can kind of prove that you're meeting the requirements. So it can be very important, but the main thing is, let's get this housing element done, certified on time, getting rezonings that you need to do on time, and that way you can be eligible and receive your state funding and grants. I will note that one of the new changes this year of the housing legislation is that HCD has now created a new county housing accountability unit that will proactively enforce the state laws. And they're actually going to be looking at the housing elements and looking primarily kind of midterm to make sure you're kind of on track and meeting your obligations. So hopefully they're there to help more than to hurt. But so that's kind of the conclusion of a deeper dive into the housing element requirements and legislation. And we're happy to answer any of your questions at the end of the presentation. But now I'd like to hand it off to Emily, who's going to talk about some of the other program requirements.
Thanks so much, Dan. Great. So part of the housing element is to have a pretty robust community outreach strategy. Community engagement and feedback is really crucial to having a successful housing element, despite it being really a mandated requirement now. While much of the document is driven by state law, the document will reflect the city's goals and priorities, and we kind of uncover what these goals and priorities are through the community outreach. So as of right now, a website is under construction, and we encourage you to check back. The web address is going to be cityofpinolehousingelement.com. And actually, I'm sorry, I realize we just revised the name of the website to be more inclusive of the other elements, but the website is under construction, and when it is up and running, it will be distributed citywide, and it will be the go-to resource for any information about the housing element, the health and safety element, and environmental justice element. And copies of recordings, including this one, will be available on that website, as well as a listing of future events. And part of those events will be 2 community workshops. We're planning to hold one in April and one in June. And there will be stakeholder focus groups in April and May to get their input on housing element. Typically, stakeholders are service organizations or entities, maybe organizations like builders groups, Chamber of Commerce, people who provide affordable housing solutions or homeless outreach, So that's kind of what we're looking for in the stakeholder focus groups. And then the 2 community workshops are geared toward just anyone and everyone in the community that has some sort of affiliation. You don't need to live in Pinole to participate. If you work in Pinole or go to school or have any interaction with the city, you're welcome to attend. Additionally, we'll be releasing a housing needs survey. The survey is going to be available in English, Spanish, Cantonese, and Tagalog. When the survey is made live, it will run for the duration of the project. So we will periodically pull survey responses from the survey service, but the survey will remain open. That way we can capture as much public opinion as possible. All right, next slide, please. So this slide kind of shows a snapshot of the schedule. This is a very compressed and consolidated version, but it kind of shows how the community engagement is going to really go throughout the project. Our community workshops are geared toward second and third quarters, stakeholder interviews, and then again, the online survey that will go through the duration of the project. We will be having a joint Planning Commission and City Council study session in quarter 3. This will be after the arena has been assessed and we've had a good chance to look at all the available opportunities and then work with the Planning Commission and City Council on getting direction of what the preferred arena strategy is going to be. Throughout this whole time, the housing element is being prepared. I think you've gathered by now between myself and Dan of just how big of an effort it is, particularly just in terms of analysis and demographic data. So that is all, it's underway now and will continue through the year. And then toward the bottom, we get into the public review and HCD review process, and then the CEQA process that will be happening concurrently. And then finally, there's the adoption and certification timeline, which shows that option to use the 120-day grace period. All right, next slide, please. Well, this wraps it up for the overview on the housing element. So now I'm going to pass it to Survey, who's going to talk about the requirements for the health and safety element.
Thank you, Emily. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So city's last health and safety element was adopted in 2010. And since then, several regulations have been introduced by the state that are to be incorporated in safety element. The state mandates updating safety element whenever there is an update to the housing element. So that's why we are updating the safety element along with the housing element. So in addition to the policies related to the natural hazards such as seismic and geologic hazards, fire, flood, and so on, the new mandates also require city to include policies related to climate adaptation and evacuation. Safety element update will include a vulnerability assessment that will inform the natural hazards adaptation and resiliency policies. We will also identify residential developments that do not have more than 2 evacuation routes. That's the new requirement. And we will also prepare an evacuation study that will evaluate capacity, safety, and viability of evacuation routes. Next slide, please. So in addition to these mandates, we are required to do consultation with CAL FIRE since parts of the city are in very high fire hazard severity zones. Other policies related to hazardous materials, crime, public awareness, and education, all these will also be looked at and included in the safety element. Since city's safety element includes health element as well, we will include relevant policies related to health elements such as multimodal transportation, access to food, park, water, community facilities, schools, transit, and so on, and air and water quality. So we'll look at the health elements that are in the city's current health and safety element. and include those as well as any other policies that city would like to see in there. So with that, I would hand it over to Noel, who will talk about the new environmental justice element.
Sounds good. Thanks, Survi. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And one more. Perfect. Well, thanks everyone for having us. I will go ahead and get started about the environmental justice element. This is a new regulatory requirement for cities in California. The environmental justice element will be designed to address systematic inequalities and injustices that stem from land use decisions that disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. So a revision of 2 or more general plan elements now triggers the need to create the environmental justice element. So the city is updating housing and safety. Now we are preparing the environmental justice element concurrently. Next slide, please. To prepare your environmental justice element, our team will be identifying the disadvantaged communities using the Office of Planning and Research guidelines and recommendations. The environmental justice element will address both the identified disadvantaged communities and the rest of the city at large. And this is really important for topics such as promoting equitable civic engagement in public decision-making, where the concern isn't strictly limited to one census tract. This is something that would apply to the whole community. The topical areas that will be addressed are outlined on this slide, and similar to the rest of the general plan elements, we will be developing policies, objectives, and implementation measures for environmental justice related topics. Next slide, please. The primary tool used to identify disproportionately burdened communities is CalEnviroScreen. This is a data mapping tool developed and maintained by the California Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment. So information regarding pollution burden, environmental effects, sensitive populations, and socioeconomic factors are they're aggregated into a percentile score. So the greater the percentile score, the greater the pollution and environmental burden. And these areas are shown on the map in orange and red. So darker shades of green will show lower scores, meaning there's a reduced pollution burden. Next slide, please. The majority of Pinole is characterized by either advantageous or average CalEnviroScreen scores. The disadvantaged community screening process begins by identifying those census tracts with scores of 75 or higher. And so Pinole has kind of a unique scenario here where the disadvantaged communities that are showing up within the city are in census tracts that are not located entirely within your jurisdiction. So the majority of the census tract with the composite score shown in the red circles is located within the city of Richmond. However, we know that pollution burden and air quality concerns and other things like that don't necessarily respect the boundaries of US Census tracts. So because of this, we are conducting further research into the data just to understand what the pollution burdens specifically are here. And this is ongoing with in coordination with the AFF investigation. Those research deliverables are fairly similar in nature. Again, I just want to reiterate that the policies will address disproportionate pollution burden in these areas along with the rest of the city. Next slide, please. And then finally, to develop the comprehensive environmental justice element that suits the needs of the city, policies were organized into the 5 topical areas above, where we have equity in access, medical care, environment, civic engagement, and in generations. This organizational structure both meets and exceeds the requirements from the Office of Planning and Research and really expands on topical areas that are unique to Pinole, such as the specific equity and medical care component. So investigations into existing conditions and policy recommendations are ongoing. And with that, I will kick it back to Emily to conclude our presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. All right, next slide, please. So we just talked about community input, but we really want to stress just how important it is. And when we talked about it initially, it was in the context of the housing element, but because the city is updating 2 elements and creating a brand new 3rd element, it was decided to roll the outreach strategy for all three elements together. So at any outreach function that we'll be holding, all three elements will be represented in the ability to comment and participate in the development if any of those elements are available. All right, next slide, please. So this is going to get us into our question and answer session. Again, the online community surveys are in a phase of development, and they will be widely distributed once completed. And again, they'll be in 4 languages. So we're really hoping to have a good response from the community. In the meantime, if there are any questions for the consultant team or anything about the housing element, or just want to leave feedback or comment, we have a dedicated member of our team who's going to be receiving and logging all of the comments so far. That's Courtney Long, and her email is right there at the bottom of the slide. So with that, that wraps up our presentation, and we can get into the Q&A session, and I'll give it back to Lily if you want to direct the flow of questions.
Sure. Thank you, Emily. I'm happy to help Mayor Pro Tem Murphy as you wish.
Sure, fantastic presentation, and thank you so much. Council members, do you have any questions? Councilor Martinez-Rubin.
I do. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your presentation. I have a list of questions, so bear with me. I'm going to go through them. They may not be in the order that you presented, but certainly they're all related. So thank you. There was mention of a constraints analysis, and I wondered how, after you have completed that, how the recommendations about minimizing those constraints actually manifest. How do they end up? How do we make those constraints actually occur? So that's one question. Would you like to hear all my questions, make note, and then come back to them, or would you like to answer them one by one?
It's a study session.
I think we can do them one by one, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, and I'll be happy to take this first one on the constraints. So it really depends on the nature of the constraint, but HCD is looking for us to respond to each and every constraint that we identify. And that's where we work in partnership with city staff and the decision makers to find solutions. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. We could find that a constraint to development is that a city has a very high parking demand. And so developers are really not interested because they don't want to supply so much parking on a site. And that's kind of just making them disinterested. We identify that high parking demand as a constraint. And then a way to alleviate that is then establishing a program in the housing element, saying that the city is going to evaluate parking needs in the city and, produce an ordinance text amendment that, will implement parking standards that are not seen as a constraint. So that's just one example. But generally, as we work through this constraints analysis, everything that we identify as a significant constraint will have some kind of corresponding program that's aimed at addressing it. Now, of course, some of the ones that are really difficult are the non-governmental constraints, because these are things that are out of the city's control. So like you have no control over mortgage interest rates or construction loans or the cost of building materials. The HCD is still going to look for some creative thinking on how to address that. And that might be with having city staff help with connecting developers to grant funding and other resources that might be available. So it really just comes down to the nature of the individual constraint.
Thank you. Is the expectation by HCD that those constraints all identified be eliminated within the 8-year period?
Yes, and in fact, they like to see kind of the low-hanging fruit be addressed fairly quickly. So things like ordinance text amendments that are generally, quick to do, things to become compliant with state law, they look for those to be done within the first, I'd say, 1 to 3 years of housing element adoption, but certainly things that are more substantial will take more time. And part of the program, this is kind of an I won't say a new thing, but it's definitely looked at much more closely, is that each program needs to have a objective criteria or standard by which we measure it, and a timeline assigned to it, and a responsible agency. It's kind of similar to, say, a mitigation monitoring and reporting plan that you might be familiar with CEQA, but it really spells out who's doing what, by how are we going to measure it, and what it needs to be done by.
Thank you. So your analyses will be completed sometime in the summer. So am I correct in thinking that by fall we will start seeing the programs that you will have recommended based on those analyses, and so the commitments that the city would make would be reflected in this fall. That would follow all your needs, the surveys, the focus groups, the interviews, et cetera, all the data collection, right? And then your background analyses of different documents that the city would provide to you. Is that correct?
Yes, and that's kind of the idea with this joint planning commission city council study session is, we'll really get feedback and direction on RENA strategy, but then also be able to present to you our analysis so far on what the community needs are and what we've identified as constraints. And one kind of, I guess, advantageous thing about the ABAG region being later in the state's cycle is that many cities share common constraints. And so we see kind of common programs to try to alleviate those. So we kind of have a big menu of potential programs that can be pulled from, but we'll get a better idea of which ones are needed once we really dig in.
Thank you. So I was glad to see some additional language, additional to the version of the slide set that we received in our packet. I had a question as to why multimodal transportation had not been mentioned, but I saw that in the slides you did reflect that, so thank you for that. There was also mention on one of the slides in our packet for the meeting, mention of the climate change vulnerability assessment, and I wondered if that would be done. I'm not certain that I heard it in your presentation a while ago. Who would do that? Would that be you as well?
Yes, that will be our team. We mentioned it in one of our slides saying that we'll be doing a vulnerability assessment, and that will inform the natural hazard adaptation and resiliency policies. And I have Noel here with me who will actually be doing the vulnerability assessment.
Thank you. I missed that. Thank you. With use of a Cal Enviro screen, what kind of pollution is specifically being considered or is considered in preparing those indices? I heard air quality, certainly, but what else?
The pollution burden, so for starters, the air quality is a substantial index. Part of that, we have things like ground level ozone, particulate matter, other things associated with like traffic congestion. Other pollution would be associated with heavy industry. There's a EnviroStore cleanup indices and other water contaminants. So it's a really comprehensive look at any kind of pollution that could affect water, air, soil, pesticides, even from agricultural pollution. I can pull the Cal Enviro Screen database and send you the report of exactly what goes into that composite score, because also included are socioeconomic factors such as education level of the population, employment factors, linguistic isolation as well. So it's quite a complicated algorithm that develops the composite score.
Thank you. I gather it would be the major water and air, pesticide, those kinds of environmental problems that no one would deny are challenges and affect health. What I was trying to get a sense of is whether we could also fit somewhere what we often hear about here in chambers, or we had been hearing prior to us closing. We'll probably continue hearing about it because it's very visible, and that's just basic litter dumping, trash that gets accumulated in particular sites. We have as an asset here in Pinole, the Pinole Creek, and there are a number of people in our city that are very concerned about the watershed. Certainly that whatever affects the watershed locally affects the San Pablo Bay as well. So please take a note of that, or let us know what you find with regard to the Pinole Creek watershed. Thank you. And you had mentioned how jurisdictions or neighboring jurisdictions, the boundaries don't necessarily, the effects of the kinds of things that you look at that could hamper or hurt health don't necessarily look at jurisdictional boundaries. Same situation with the Pinole Creek watershed. Some of it extends into the county jurisdiction as well as, is part of the cities. Thank you for that. I do have a couple of more questions. There was one slide that you had before the one on community input. I was particularly looking for the mention of walkable neighborhoods. In my mind, what is related to that is lighting, street lights, that kind of infrastructure, maybe old school, but still necessary, whether it's electric or otherwise. We still could use some additional lights, and there are some areas in Pinole that are quite old and could be more walkable if there were adequate amounts of light, which is why I like daylight savings time. Sidewalks as well, the condition of our sidewalks. If we are to promote walking, making a walkable city, we also have to be concerned about the, again, unfortunately, our city doesn't necessarily have its sidewalk conditions uniform throughout the city, reflecting how some neighborhoods are older than others, and consequently the concrete that makes them is not necessarily even and makes it a danger to anyone who would like to walk on them, and especially those who might have some balance difficulties, and I'm thinking about seniors.
If I could just comment on that really quickly, it brings up a very interesting intersection between some of these elements, particularly in the housing element. You wouldn't really think of a housing element as addressing things like sidewalks, but as part of the fair housing assessment and affirmatively furthering fair housing, HCD is really looking for cities to make specific place-based improvements. And this could even be things like improving sidewalks in underserved areas or in areas where, like you said, the sidewalk is just in poor condition and then maybe it's not safe for someone who needs to use a wheelchair or a walker. So there's definitely going to be some crossover and intersection between the health and safety element, environmental justice element, and the housing element.
Super great.
I just wanted to follow up with what Emily was saying. In our equity and access component of the environmental justice element, we're definitely going to be looking at access in terms of walkability, bikeability, people being able to connect to retail centers, employment centers, those sorts of investigations. So like Emily was saying, what we have coordinated with the housing element is very closely related, and one of those items are really at the forefront of our mind.
Yes.
And to add that a lot of policies that are in health and safety element, we will look through those, and if we see that the health policies have a better home in EJ element, then we will probably make a decision with the city staff to move those policies to environmental justice element instead of the health and safety element. And there will probably also be crossovers with mobility elements. So while taking a look at things like crosswalks, lighting, and multimodal transportation, access to transit, we will take a look at the mobility element as well to see we are not suggesting something that mobility element is already talked about. And it's complementary to that.
If I could just tag on one little bit, that kind of local knowledge is really important. So we look to you and staff and the community to help identify any of these areas where there may be some particular needs, particularly with examples like that may be underserved or differently served. So street trees, sidewalks, lighting, anything that you wouldn't think it's purely housing, but again, it's trying to improve the overall housing situation and livability. So the things that you just mentioned were the things, and if there's particular examples, we'd really like to hear those. So some of those we can address through the survey, or you can get to the website and make some comments, and we'll definitely be looking at those. So that really helps us a lot with the preparation of the housing element and makes it a better element overall.
Thank you. And I think, I'll turn over to staff because I think they can, with a nod, realize that I am very pleased to hear that you have such a comprehensive approach to this housing element, because I've been trying to make a points and or a case about being comprehensive with regard to housing and what it entails. And it's not just about the structural or the physical structures, but specific to land use, but overall a more comprehensive approach, not just to address the immediate sheltering needs, but as well, again, the quality of life for anyone who resides wherever additional housing is built. So thank you for that. I have more to my list. Bear with me. Dan, I think if I'm reading your name correctly, pardon me if I'm not, I think I am. You mentioned trees, so yes, tree canopies, wherever those might be, could be helpful to us and also probably help address environmental or climate change concerns as well. Although Cal Enviro Screen offers a quite a means of identifying different ways to determine what would be a healthy place, I would like to suggest, and for the record, make it a point to let you know of an additional resource that's available, and you are probably aware of it and maybe have used it in your work elsewhere. And that's the Healthy Places Index, which was developed by the Public Health Alliance of Southern California. Healthyplacesindex.org is the website, and on that website are a number of different resources and also a listing of statewide departments that currently use that tool to identify a number of different program areas in the interest of having a comprehensive approach to healthy places. They also produce a means to identify or to help us determine, any one of its users determine where Pinole stands relative to other places in the state. We are at 79.9 according to their indices, which means that there are Pinole has healthy community conditions, better healthy community conditions than other California census tracts, and so that's pretty good, but there's still room for improvement, right? And then if we're thinking about the next 8 years, probably room for improvement there. So among the kinds of things that that index weighs are economic, education, transportation, social and neighborhood, housing, clean environment, and healthcare access, which are all areas that you have already told us about, so thank you very much. But I would suggest taking a look at that, and all council members as well, and the public, because there are some very specific program areas that may or may not fit Pinole, but for us to think about. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely didn't want it to seem like Cal Enviro Screen's the only resource we use. We overlay data from several resources, and the Healthy Places Index is actually one of OPR's top resources that they list in their environmental justice guidance. So I'm glad that we're in agreement. It's an excellent resource, and Pinole shows well on that tool. We will be relying on that one amongst others, HCD data, state census tract data, really to overlay it and map it so we have a comprehensive view of the city and are able to look at the census tracts really at a granular level to understand your community as best we can.
Thank you. I've said in a different council meeting very recently that a number of the state laws are looking to have their local cities, local jurisdictions address housing needs statewide, and certainly that doesn't get past us, the necessity to increase housing. What gets my attention is the matter of density. And am I correct to interpret that we're still thinking about the very low income and low income populations having the most minimum densities relative to communities that are more affluent? Because to me, that alone seems to be a disparity. You had a table that reflected the minimum density to meet different income levels, where there were 20 dwelling units per acre, possibly 30, depending on population. And that 20 dwelling units per acre, if I read the table correctly, reflected the very low and low income communities. So if I just look at that alone or in comparison to the more affluent communities, we're still talking about a disparity, in my opinion. Is that a correct interpretation, or am I looking at it completely way off? Am I way off there?
I'll try to answer that one. But as I mentioned in my presentation, the state uses density as a proxy for affordable housing or affordability. And so they look for those minimum densities. So if you've got areas that are zoned for 20 or 30 or more dwelling units per acre, that will count toward meeting your RHNA requirement in the housing element. It doesn't necessarily mean that is affordable. So when it comes toward the end of the cycle and the annual reviews, what actually gets built and what gets kind of controlled or regulated as affordable housing. So whether it's subsidized or created through density bonuses or inclusionary housing ordinances, those are the units that actually count. So as we project our yields with our site analysis, we want to be as close as possible or realistic to what actually is going to get done. We don't want to think, if it's zoned for 20 or 30 dwelling units per acre and it gets developed with 100 units, that all 100 units are going to be affordable. We can count that, but when it comes to at the end, state is going to look to see what actually gets built. And so you get kind of graded at the beginning with your housing element, and then you get graded at the end to see how well you've actually performed. I think your concern is that there's kind of an inequity there, is that it doesn't mean that the affordable units have to be high density, but generally that's how they get built. They're just more efficient. The units tend to be smaller, less costly to build on a per unit basis when they're multifamily. So that's where that comes from. And then in terms of the fair housing and environmental justice, all those other things, we're looking to make sure people have access and choice as much as possible. But to try to make single family or low density housing affordable is very, 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 very difficult. The one way that we can do that and get a distribution into maybe those more affluent areas, and HCD has acknowledged this, is through those accessory dwelling units. So that is one tool that kind of allows for the creation of affordable housing, but in low density areas. So that's maybe one answer, or some comfort that there are a number of different tools and ways to do that. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you for your response and acknowledging the way I'm seeing this is still could be a little concerning. Yes, okay, I'll leave it at that. Also, in trying to understand what 1 acre is, as visual as I can be, I understand that to be about 75% the size of an American football field. So is that pretty much it? It's a football field minus the end zones is how I'm looking at it. So then I would say there's room to build horizontally, or there's room to build up, and I guess to be seen. That's it for me for now, and I'm looking forward to other presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Martinez-Ruben. Councilor Toms?
Sure. Is this, do you want both comments and questions
Just
at
questions
this time?
for now.
Just questions, okay. Because I do have comments, and I want to make sure that I don't miss the opportunity for that. So many of the questions that I had have already been answered, but I just wanted to highlight one of them is that when we're planning for the RHNA, the higher density, we can count those as at certain affordability levels. But when we get to the annual performance review after the building has been built, that's when it's broken down into what has actually been built. And I just wanted to highlight that. The other question, though, that I had was regarding the buffer units that you're looking at planning. In Pinole, we have a baseline maximum density, and any developer who's coming in has to comply with our inclusionary housing ordinance and provide affordable units that way, and then they automatically get a density bonus over and above what our maximum density is. Would that not be the area where we can collect the buffer?
Unfortunately, that will help you in terms of meeting, like you said, kind of the end report card. When you get those density bonuses and those units actually get constructed, you'll be able to count those then, but we can't assume that we're going to get those density bonuses on the front end. So we're not able to count those density bonuses going forward, or as part of the original RENA sites assessment and a total allocation. I'll qualify that a little bit, is that we need to demonstrate all of our kind of trends and document all of our assumptions. And the one thing that we've been able to do some cases where there has been a lot of use of the density bonus, we've shown trends kind of globally. Hey, there's say 10 projects that were built in the last period, and the yield versus their maximum zoning potential is kind of X percent. And usually it's 75% or something like that. It varies by zoning district and by city. But in some cities, they've done a really good job of encouraging and using the density bonus. So in some cases, they're getting 110% because they were able to maximize under the zoning and then get a density bonus on top of it. And so they end up being more than 100% of what the zoning allowed. If we can show strong trends like that, then we can increase our yield assumptions. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at and working with city staff and all the records to document, and again, make sure that we've got very good, sound, and well-reasoned and documented assumptions for things like that.
Okay, and then another question is regarding the safety element. There was a reference to the CAL FIRE maps, and I'm wondering if the updated maps have been released yet.
You're wondering if we'll be using the updated maps?
If CAL FIRE has released updated maps?
Yes, we will be using whatever CAL FIRE has on their website, whatever data is available on their website, and we will also check that with the fire chief and the city to make sure that they're accurate.
Okay, thank you. And those are the only questions. I will have several comments, though.
Thank you, Councillor Toms. Councillor Tave, do you have any questions?
No questions.
All right. I have a few questions for the presenter as well as Director Whalen. I wanted to talk through a few questions I had regarding data collection. So first of all, great presentation, lots of information there. I'm glad this is a study session where we can study together. The first couple of slides that you all had were in reference to the data collection process that's going to my belief, start in April. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that's going to look like? If you can repeat that, that would be helpful.
Sure, I can address some of that, and I'm sure Dan will follow me in case I miss anything. But we rely on publicly available data from a variety of sources. So some of it will come from your regional government, from the Association of Bay Area Governments. We'll also be getting data from the American Community Survey and from the United States Census. So those are kind of like the big data sources in terms of demographics and socioeconomics that we rely upon for the needs assessment. But then it's also interwoven with what we gather through community outreach. And like Dan mentioned, local knowledge is really, really important, because as consultants, we can only know so much. We don't live in Pinole. We don't know what your issues are. We don't know, where the sidewalk's not good, or, where is it that, homeless are in the city? And then what kind of services do they need? Or, what kind of housing issues are people having? So it's through the community outreach portion that we really get to gather that local level. So really the analysis is kind of twofold. We've got like this big data component from the census and American Community Survey. And then we tell that story in the context of the local knowledge.
And
Yeah,
so,
I'll just,
yes,
Emily mentioned, but the online survey that'll be posted soon, the comments that we get through the website, and then through the community workshops will provide a lot of additional information. And we're actually required to specifically acknowledge that and address those and kind of tie in our housing plan with the public comments and how they relate to each other. So it's part of the housing element update.
Yeah, and I guess I forgot one key contributor, but that's the city's fair housing service provider. And usually it's an entity that's contracted with the city to provide fair housing services, but they're also mandated by the state to collect certain data, and we work with them to get that data. And that's typically if there's been complaints of any fair housing issues, things that are maybe ADA inaccessibility or discrimination in the home buying or home renting process.
Okay. Do we anticipate this community survey being mostly open-ended questions? Are there pieces of specific data points that you all are looking to get answered with numeric value?
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Yep,
I can't really hear you very well.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, way better. Thank you.
Oh, listen, I'm learning. The question I had was regarding the community survey. Are you all looking to have that be open-ended and for folks to share narrative and more qualitative data, or are you anticipating questions that will give us a specific numeric answer, or I guess quantitative answers to questions?
It's actually going to be a combination of both. So there will be some questions that have A, B, C, D, and oftentimes in that list there might be an option for other, and they can write in a response. And then there will be some open-ended questions as well. Of course, questions that have defined answers are much easier for us to analyze, especially in terms of consensus. But those open-ended questions are equally important.
Gotcha. Thank you. And so to follow up on that, one of the concerns I have with regards to the process at this point is the level of detail as well as the dictionary and language that we are using. As a mayor pro tem, I am probably more familiar with this language given the meetings I attend, obviously conversations like this, but I'm a little concerned about the public's understanding of some of these larger concepts as well as even just small language. I mean, what I would consider, small, but it may not be small to someone else, simply like the term climate change. I'm wondering what are the opportunities you all are providing for folks and our residents to understand that language prior to the data collection, prior to the community survey?
That's a good question. And definitely the presentation you received tonight is a little higher level than what we would be presenting at community workshop. And the way we've kind of framed it is that the first community workshop is an introduction to what a housing element or health and safety, environmental justice element is. And it's really to provide the community with a primer. And then that second workshop will dig in a little bit more. But we do work pretty hard to keep things in layman's terms as much as we can. And then in making ourselves available, for questions. All of our surveys are done anonymously. So we really want to encourage people to just be forthcoming and not feel like they need to hide. And then same thing in our community workshops, there is an ability to anonymously type in questions. And then the last thing is the website that we're creating is going to have a ton of information on it. Again, it'll be in layman's terms, and there'll be links to additional resources. So I'm hoping that that's enough to kind of address that concern of just community understanding. But certainly we're open to suggestions if the city's identified something that's worked for you and would like us to implement.
I'll add a little bit to that, Mayor, is in like this session, all the online sessions will be recorded. And so that does provide an opportunity to go back later and review these things. So once people can repeat and maybe go at their own speed or at their own convenience and can maybe learn a little bit more about these things. So we try to do that. And we do try to make the survey questions targeted, but we do try to make them easy. So it doesn't require any particular or special knowledge. Sometimes we do provide a little more kind of exposition and context to help explain a concept so that we can get an appropriate answer. So it's kind of a balancing act there.
Great. A balancing act. I love it. What I'm hearing is this is going to be about a 14-month process at most. It seems like May 2023 is us procrastinating doing our homework, but we're going to do our homework. And we're going to get it in. One of the questions I have is in regards to I feel like we've talked a lot about housing as an accessibility issue because we're even thinking about the health and safety and environmental justice. I'm wondering about the construction, and I'm thinking about construction materials and that type of process, which I think even prior to me serving on council, but also I think the public doesn't always think of, has thought about it, but not necessarily has said it. How does the construction happen, right? Oftentimes we see something pop up and it kind of is a blessing to the community or for some. I'm wondering about how those conversations may come into this conversation as we think about housing and land use, not just the building of housing, but the actual construction materials.
Well, I'll start. I'm not sure I fully understand what you're looking for an answer, but part of it is the city is not responsible to build any of this housing. So you're there to kind of create a great environment for it. But the premise is that the private sector or affordable housing developers, maybe nonprofits, will actually implement the plan or actually build the housing. There's other components of the plan that the city will implement, and that's removing constraints and implementing the various programs that we come up with. That could include rezoning, et cetera. But the actual construction is up to the developers to do that. So it's kind of, the old, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. So your job is to lead the horse or the developer, create that nice place for the horse to drink, but and make that as attractive as possible. But I'm not sure if that's what you wanted or if you're actually interested in what about the design and the materials and how, the physical aspects of the construction. That typically is beyond what would be included in a housing element. That would relate more toward your development standards and maybe design guidelines. Many communities have design guidelines that provide direction and suggestion and encouragement to build the ways that you would like to see construction or building types done.
Yeah.
So that would be separate from the housing element.
Okay, that is. Oh yes, please.
Just to add to that, we will look into we won't exactly look into the building code, but we will talk to the city and we will figure out if there are code updates that need to be done related to fire safety, fuel modification, or crime prevention through environmental design, those kind of things. And then we'll have broad policies in safety element to address those if we see some deficiencies or the city tells us that there are deficiencies at various places where they need to do code modification. And that will become an implementation strategy in the safety element.
Fantastic. And that definitely answered the question. I was trying to understand a little bit more about the scope. I feel like there was a lot of educational information. I'm just wondering, what questions are we going to answer in the long run? To that extent, I wanted just to ask this as a follow-up to that question. Are we going to be in this process talking about those who live in the housing, right? Tenant protections has been a huge conversation in both the city and the state, and I'm thinking about even protections for those who want to buy property and understanding sellers, for example, who may want to buy property and want to know the impacts of the climate crisis around whether it's screening for sea level rise or access to a high fire risk. Is that part of this process? Do we ask questions around this process? Are you thinking about it, I guess, in that way?
As a part of outreach, we have questions targeted towards the safety aspects and generally related to what kind of education materials they would like, what are the hazards that they have experienced, what kind of emergency preparedness they have done already, and we're trying to understand from them what are the hazards that they're more concerned about. But as far as safety element is concerned, we'll have a lot of maps in the safety element with overlaid parcel maps, and it will be very clear to the reader to know where the property is and what kind of hazards are related to that particular parcel. So that information will be provided as a part of our existing conditions report.
Great. Well, thank you again for your presentation this evening. That concludes my questions. I don't think any other counselors have questions. Oh, Counselor Martinez-Rubin has 2 more questions. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. This is why I like these study sessions. One of them is, this is not one of the April workshops. Is that correct? Is there another one? Is there a workshop scheduled? And I'll tell you why I asked. Well, please answer that question. Is this one of the workshops that you identified?
No, so this is really intended to be just a study session for the council. Of course, the public is, able to be here and to comment if they would like, but the idea is to really give you as the decision makers kind of the background that you'll need to help us work through the process.
Good, because we all have work to do. There are only 4 members of the public in the audience tonight. Okay. One suggestion, and this was something that I, in a different context, I've appreciated as I've come to begin to be part of the process of a board of a body that's supposed to make decisions, and that is that with every meeting packet, there is a list of commonly used terms for that particular field. I'm sure there's somebody who has put something together for housing and the other elements. So including that is something that I think would be very helpful, so we all have a clue as to what we're talking about. And then question, if you could please clarify for me, the number of units that were not built for RENA cycle number 5, the one we're currently in, does that balance roll over into RENA cycle number 6, or are we starting from scratch? Are the 500 units that we're supposed to be building by 2031, does that number include the balance for the current cycle?
You should, this is Dan. We don't anticipate any carryover from the 5th cycle to the 6th cycle. And the way to prevent that is a possibility, but that's if you don't maintain your RENA capacity throughout the whole period. So if you had all of your RENA sites were developed at less than what you projected, and you didn't have anything left in their buffer, and you weren't able to correct that by the end of the period, then there would be carryover. But we don't anticipate that because you're well managed. So, but that's why they have those annual progress reports. So it kind of keeps you honest along the way. Every year, the way you kind of look at it and see, are we on track or not? And are we maintaining our inventory? So, but that is a possibility going forward. And that's why we recommended, and HCD recommends, that buffer. And then we also have those reasonable assumptions, so we don't end up having a deficit that we can't cure by the end of the period. So hopefully that helps. Yeah. Shouldn't be any carryover. And I like the idea of the FAQ or the glossary. We have prepared that for some of our focus group folks, just so we can have a involved discussion with some of our stakeholders. So often I shouldn't say often, but we have prepared kind of FAQs and key terms, so we might be able to make that available too.
Thank you. Yes, Director Whalen presented us with an updated report, and there were balances, and I was wondering whether, for my understanding, please, Director Whalen, then do I understand correctly that the balance of units that were not built, won't be built for various reasons through 2023, are those part of that 500 that we are now obligated to facilitate in the new RENA cycle?
So no, I believe the answer is no. We'll triple check that, but I don't think that Pinole will have a carryover. I think that over the last 8 years, we have evaluated any sites that are on our opportunities sites list to make sure that any land use decisions regarding zoning or any development applications have not taken away from other sites that were anticipated to be developed in the planning period, or if they were, then we made up for it on another site. So I do not think that we will need to carry over any of the balance from the 5th cycle that we have at the end of June here, and we'll be starting fresh. That's what I anticipate.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to public comment now. And if the city clerk will have public comments, please.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So we have one in-person speaker, Rafael Menes.
Greetings, Mayor Pro Tem, Council, staff, and members of the public. First off, I'd like to tie back into Councilmember Martinez Rubin's comments / questions just now about our unfilled RENA allocation for the current cycle, because that was something I noticed looking over the consent calendar for our prior meeting. On page 102 of the March 15th agenda, you can see that we have an estimated pipeline of 50 very low affordability housing units in development within the 5th cycle. And so, to quote the staff report, it says, "It should be noted that this is true with the notable exception of the very low income affordability category, which is expected to have a deficit of 30 units in the 5th cycle." And also tying back in somewhat to the council member's earlier comments about density versus equity, I'd note that some of the higher density developments, like say the Appian Village condominiums, are noted as being relatively high density, and they're all moderate or mostly above moderate income. Again, as noted on page 102 of the March 15th agenda. Let's see. Secondly, I guess my second question sort of ties into whether the mandate on things being actually built applies only to the new housing cycle or to this cycle, because as the city has stated, it expects to have an underbuilding of its requirement for very low income housing units. And I know that in the next cycle, if that happened, it would trigger penalties. I'm not sure if it will do that in this cycle, so that's a question I have. Let's see. There was one slide towards the end of the presentation, I want to say around slide 36, 37 or so, that had a list of the various different equity categories that I don't see in the agenda packet that was posted online. That would be useful to have, I think. I'm wondering also whether the proposed environmental justice communities and the EnviroScreen analysis include the potential future impacts of climate change, as well as the present environmental impacts from current pollution sources. I note that the Planning Commission in particular has flagged one particular sidewalk area as being an issue of importance that's in one of the yellow zones in this enviro analysis, but that could potentially fall under equity issues. And now a question with regards to time remaining. Since this is a study session, am I limited to 3 minutes strictly, or do I have additional time?
You can continue, Mr. Menes.
Thank you. So with regards to the fire maps that were brought up, one of the things that I learned when I went to the Planning Commission Academy this last week was there was a presenter there from CAL FIRE who, as part of his presentation, discussed the fact that CAL FIRE's new maps include wind data, which the current maps apparently do not. They're just based on biomass for calculations of fire risk. Now, since anybody who lives in Pinole knows that wind is a significant part of Pinole's climate and the fire risks there and on too, I think it'd be very important to make sure that we use the new maps for our health and safety element updates, particularly with regards to the evacuation zone requirements mentioned, the multiple evacuation routes requirements mentioned on slide 29, I think it is, under the health and safety program updates, because that was one of the reasons that led to our wanting to update the safety element in the first place, was Pinole Valley in particular being an area that only really had or could have one feasible evacuation route. Let's see. I thought I had more comments. Oh yes, with regards to the online housing needs survey, I was curious as to how the city and the consulting group intend to notice and make sure that that survey goes out to, I guess, as broad a group of people as possible, assuming it's not a randomly selected survey, but it's intended to encompass as wide a portion of the community as possible. And then, with regards to the affirmatively furthering fair housing element, it noted that in particular it looked to remedy racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty and affluence. And I think that might tie somewhat back into the environmental justice element, having limitations in what it can track because it's based on the census level data. I suspect that if you're going to be tracking down particular clusters of affluence or deprivation, that you aren't necessarily going to find them at the census level in Pinole, but that you might be able to find them, say, at the block level. So is the city planning to do more narrow scale breakdowns of the city as a whole for both the purposes of the environmental justice community tracking and the purposes of the affirmatively furthering fair housing portion? Let's see. I think that's everything for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Menez. Other public comment?
No, there are no more public comments.
Okay.
And Mayor, I just want, Mayor Pro Tem, I just wanted to note, it's been referenced a couple times that there's a revised PowerPoint, so I'll make sure that we get that posted on the agenda page for the public for future reference.
Fantastic. Thank you, Madam City Clerk. All right, so I will take the conversation back to the council and close public comment. Thank you so much for those who spoke tonight. And we are just beginning our conversation. So do any council members have other questions or comments? Yes, Councilor Toms.
Thank you. I have several comments. To start with, on the slide, one of the slides that was changed on 33 of 47, on our copy it says county will use the term environmental justice communities. And I wanted to note that I know that the two environmental justice or disadvantaged community census tracts are right adjacent to two unincorporated communities that are also EJ communities. And the county currently has a general plan process underway, and after a lot of community input, the community members from those areas have requested that they not be referred to as disadvantaged communities, and they came up with the term of impacted communities. It was a term that was, a bit more respectful for those the folks in those communities. And my request would be that since these two communities, whether it's in the city or in unincorporated areas, just separated by a boundary, but they share a census tract, that we might want to think about using a similar term. So it's impacted communities is what's used. Then a number of other comments. The one about the updated CAL FIRE maps. I understood that CAL FIRE was to be updating their maps. And we have a community of single-family homes that is surrounded by areas that are in the high fire hazard severity zone. And those areas only have one way in and one way out. So if you take a look at SB 99 that requires an evaluation of those areas, it doesn't necessarily fit very carefully. But I think if there's any areas that would change their designation, it might be that one, because it's completely surrounded. And the neighborhood I'm referring to is the neighborhood on Galbraith. On the unincorporated area side of that boundary is all within the high fire, very high fire hazard severity zone. And then parts in the city are, but just not that particular neighborhood. So I would caution us to almost work towards thinking about that as if it were in that area, because the revised CAL FIRE maps could come out, the day after we adopt this, and then we'll be, having to revisit it very soon. As far as, I have a program suggestion for, and I know we're not quite there yet, but I'll throw it out there, is that the city take a look at pre-planning ADUs. If we take a look at providing both approved design and construction level drawings for maybe 2 sizes of ADUs, that might help some of our residents really decide that they might make that investment, because a lot of times people are hesitant to go through the planning process and hire an architect or drafter if they don't know that their plans are going to get approved. But if we have pre-approved plans, that would be a suggestion. I understand that some of the state money, I think it's SB2 money, could be used for that. And then the other thing, I know on the side where we're looking at providing plenty of housing and identifying housing sites, I would caution us against identifying any of those housing sites within our regional commercial areas. I think that there's been a lot of community outpouring of concern in that area, and I might even take it a little bit further that in those areas, perhaps we get to the zoning update, perhaps we make those conditional, that the housing become a conditional use, not a permitted use, because it seems that we have in our specific plan provided a policy for a conditional type of development, and then the density bonus, it's been interpreted that we can just wash that away. So I think we need to, both encourage housing in certain areas, but we also need to protect our regional commercial areas. And some of the housing laws, although intended very well, we have seen, the other side of it where it could create some significant impacts to the makeup of our community, and we don't have the local control to keep that up. So with that, I want to thank all of you for your presentation, and I look forward to going through this process. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Toms. Councillor Martinez-Rubin, do you have any questions or comments?
Thank you. Yes, comment. I'll add to something. I was going to call you Dr. Toms. As Councilmember Toms. What you said about the commercial areas, I think, part of that local knowledge that the consultant group asked about, and I think Director Whalen, you can also add to this in your work with your peer our finance director, recognizing our major sources of income are our sales taxes. And those largely contribute to our general fund, which eventually leads down to how well the conditions are of our environment. So it's not far-fetched when we say keep in mind that there is some importance and relevance to the commercial areas, and why we're making a comment about paying attention to those as something that's also important here in Pinole, because we are not a job center yet, because we have only so many lots that can accommodate housing at all, et cetera. So thank you for mentioning that, Councilmember Thoms. The other component to this, I'm not sure whether this came out in the presentation by Michael Baker's group, was the respect for and maintenance of open space. And this is related to where there are developed open spaces or our parks. And we certainly we don't lack parks here in Pinole. We have a nice ratio of them. And I think that was, for whatever reason, back when the city was planned, for whether it was for aesthetic reasons only or however they have helped. But it's also important, I shouldn't say but, and it is important to keep those as well as undeveloped open space as areas that are important overall for the maintenance of an ecosystem that is beyond humans, but that also contributes to the health of an environment. And that's, in my opinion, and I think in others here in the city, of equal importance, again, related to having shelter, certainly, but as well the natural amenities that make up an area like Pinole. We are very fortunate to live surrounded by natural amenities, natural assets, and fortunately or unfortunately, to sacrifice those for the sake of meeting our numbers would, I think, be a detriment overall. So thank you for listening to that. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Councilor Martinez-Rubin. Councilor Tave, do you have any comments or questions?
No comments, just thank you for the presentation. It's informative, and look forward to having more conversations about it.
Thank you, Councilor Tave. Just a few comments from me. I wanted to write down a few things. I wanted to also double down. Thank you, Councilor Martinez-Rubin, on mentioning the dictionary, what I consider a health and land use dictionary. I think that would be a valuable asset to our website. I think the website idea is a great idea in itself, so looking forward to seeing the launch of that, as well as what we can store there as ways to share tools and resources and happenings of this process over the next 14 months. So I would look forward to that. I do want to center also the Gantt chart that was shown. Thank you so much, the presenters. I thought that was a very valuable asset to engaging and educating the community around what's going to happen within those 14 months. If we can share that, I think that would be even better printed out than it was online. So if we can find a way to share something like that, I think printed would be a valuable asset for our community. I wanted to offer a couple of things. In this process, I do believe that the data collection is going to be really important. I do know that there are several mentions of resources and studies that have already been created. I'm wondering how we can get as much data as possible for this process, specifically for Pinole residents and visitors. This is something that would, of course, enable a more data-enabled decision-making process for the element itself, but I also think it would be very helpful for what I see as a broader general plan process as well. So I'm being a little selfish thinking about our entire plan. So I'm just wondering if we can have more discussions or more, decision points that we can as a council play a part of in terms of that data collection. I think that's going to be a really important part. So that was some of my direction for staff. If you all can circle back with us about how to create a better process or more robust process for feedback there. I did see one slide around a joint planning commission meeting as well as a joint city council planning commission meeting. I do know that we have a lot going on in the city right now, including what is going to be a pretty long budget process likely. So and I do recognize and respect the July decision. Given the heftiness of this topic, as well as the what I see as a huge need around our community engagement model and program, I would love to see us do that a little earlier and also plan out several others. I don't know what number that is, but it would be, I think, a huge benefit if our planning commission as well as our council was able to discuss this together in one space. So I did see July. If that means we need to do something earlier, that would be great. I understand that you all have developed a timeline intentionally. So one of the things I will say is if we can add a few more of those on our timeline, even one more, I think that would also allow for ongoing conversation. So just wanted to amplify that. And lastly, also wanted to share what I see as a critical resource to this conversation around building equitable housing through the climate lens, which I heard a few council members speak to this. But there's an organization called the Greenbelt Alliance that has launched what is called the Resilience Playbook. This is focused on a few pillars that I think we've talked about today, including health and safety, but also including issues around, again, building equitable housing and protecting our communities against flood, drought, and wildfire. And what I think we've all kind of heard, and we've heard in previous council meetings as well, is this area in our community has been deeply impacted by wildfires. And so we want to be thinking ahead about how do we address the housing crisis, both in an equitable way, but also in a way that centers specifically the issues which we hopefully will get through the data, but I think our experiences say enough, which are wildfires and quite possibly even sea level rise. So I think that would be an excellent resource to inform this process. If there's a way that we can also partner with that organization around some of the community engagement program we have going, I think that would be a valuable asset to this. And then last but not least, I am always thinking about our opportunities and accessibility of this program, particularly as we think about 14 months, how can we get the most feedback in so many different ways possible? So I did see that one of your slides mentioned video. I am interested in what that would look like, as well as just simply audio. Folks who may not want to write their online survey, but folks who may, in a different language, say something that could be very beneficial to this process. And how we would actually compile that type of data is of interest to me, of course. But I think about family members who use voicemail or audio messages nowadays as a way to explain themselves, because sometimes writing may be too difficult, and certainly the city council meetings are not always best for folks who may have a little bit more nerves than us. So I think for me, it would be great to explore those two ideas as well. And again, great presentation. Thank you all so much. I know that was a lot of work that was on your behalf, and looking forward to more. And I see a comment or question from Councilor Martinez-Rubin.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I actually have a question for you, if you would please clarify, because I don't want,
Sure.
I just clarification. When you mentioned deeply impacted by wildfires, I don't recall specifically Pinole, but were you alluding to neighboring counties and how the air quality has affected Pinole? Or could you please clarify?
Yeah. So across California, I think we've all experienced the impact of wildfires, whether it's specific communities that have had wildfires in their own communities, or like you mentioned, our community, I think we woke up to orange days. I think we all remember that. That was before the pandemic, but we woke up to days where our air was impacted by wildfires that happened in neighboring communities. And so I think as we think about this as an issue, as we think about some of our more, again, areas that have been more impacted, again, being closer to, open space, I think we just need to think about that through this lens.
Yeah, certainly thinking about it is one thing. I just wanted to make sure that we understood what you were referring to and the potential for Pinole to be affected by wildfires. The degree to which we've been affected, fortunately, has not been as severe as in neighboring counties, I believe.
Awesome. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
All right. So any other questions or comments? All right, I don't see any. I don't see any council members with comments or questions. Well, in that case, I just want to circle back, and I know the direction for tonight was around receiving our report and discussing it, but also providing direction to city staff. So Director Whalen and City Manager Murray, do you have any questions about the comments that were said tonight by council members, or any thoughts?
Thank you for raising the question. I thought it was a great discussion. I think the comments and questions raised by the council members are well documented, and we're happy to follow up with the Michael Baker International team to execute those as practical. Thank you.
Fantastic. Director Whalen, did you have any final thoughts or questions or affirmations?
Thank you all. Thank you all for your attention. I know this is a lot of information. It's a really big project, a big lift for the city here. We're going to be doing a lot of work together over the next 14 months, and we're excited about working with this whole team here. So thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, do we need, City Manager Murray, do we need a formal motion on that feedback, or is the content of our comments enough?
Yeah, no formal motions needed.
Okay, City Attorney Casher, was that fine too? Or did you have a comment?
Yep, we're good as it is.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, well, thank you so much, Council, and thank you to the public for coming out. This is one baby step in a long 14-month process, so invite your friends, invite 2 friends, maybe even 3. Thank you all to the public who is watching. You are also very special here, so if you have comments next time, please join us. And with that being said, I want to thank everybody for attending and participating this evening, and it is 8:07 p.m. and I adjourn this meeting of the March 29th special meeting. I adjourn to the March 29th special meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.